I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
And we're here talking to another Maurin Academy legend, associate, associate legend.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Obviously, you're talking about Spencer here, not me. That's
no, it's you. It's you. Bryant Macfarlane, our historian, and folks they heard from you on my channel, Political Philosophy, but you haven't been on Dustbowl Diatribes yet. So I think maybe the first thing we ought to do is just have you kind of introduce yourself a little bit. Like, what are you doing? I know you're a grad student history PhD program, but like, tell us a little about yourself.
Okay. Well, I like long walks on the beach and, samba music. No, that's just aside. No, so I am a PhD candidate currently. My area of focus is America in the 20th century. And I really look at the way that technology and institutions overlap to create create a society as it exists at that time. So it's a slightly different approach than what most historians use, which I think is refreshing. But in a number of other ways, it makes it so that I am more, I guess, open to other aspects of history that are quite often sort of left out of the textbook examples of things. So that's what I do. I spent a long time in the Army doing things that the nation asked of me, whatever, for 23 years. So I've traveled around the world. I've seen a lot of things, and I attribute a lot of that to sort of flavoring my worldviews. So I'm just happy to be here with both you and Spencer, and hope that we can have an interesting discussion about the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, thank you. That's cool. Yeah, actually, and just as sort of like context, we're all in a book group together, or a discussion group or a reading group, and we read together Dustbowls of Empire by Spencer. Do you remember the author's name?
Hannah Holleman.
Yes, thank you, Hannah Holleman. And we had different takes on it, and I thought that might be a good place to start. But we read that book because we're interested in this concept of, metabolic rift that Jacob and Spencer talked about in the last episode, like how badly people can kind of mess up Mother Nature, right? Is that politically correct? Probably isn't. Mess things up in nature. So I maybe to just get started, maybe we can just talk briefly about that book and like our take on it. But Bryant, guest of honor, what was memory? It's been about 2 months or so. But what was your view of that book and your take on it?
So I thought it was okay. I'm torn about Holleman's book. I will say this: I thought at least the introduction and the first chapter were well worth anyone reading. It was really a very good sort of literature review about the history of the Dust Bowl, and I think it's one of those things that most people associate the Dust Bowl with the entirety of the nation in the 1930s, when realistically, the Dust Bowl was a fairly tightly grouped set of counties. The Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, sort of Kansas borderlands there. And really everything sort of spread from that point. That was the hardest hit. The real true epicenter of the Dust Bowl really was here, and it moved out. So a number of historians have really started calling it the dry 30s, and moving away from the Dust Bowl as an overall encapsulation, and really just looking at the whole of the decade as a dry era. And it was, meteorologically speaking, a very dry, unnaturally dry era for a lot of the North American plain. But that was a very different experience that was going on sort of on the periphery than what it was in the heartland. And so it kind of moved in an epicenter from that point. But really looking at it, it's sort of a centralized problem that grew from a much bigger problem. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But other than the fact that most of the rest of the book felt like a literature review in long form, telling me who said what every time about this, Holleman left me very hollow. She didn't offer many solutions. She didn't offer many call to action. It was just, this is a really bad situation we found ourselves in, full stop. So I would have liked to have found something in that would have offered me an idea, a solution, even if it wasn't maybe the most practicable solution, to have offered something new to the conversation other than we've put ourselves into a very bad place. So that's kind of where I left the book.
Yeah, I remember kind of coming away with the thought that what she wanted was something that it wasn't well thought out, like we would like. But I guess the closest thing I could think of is that because there was quite a discussion of the settler colonial causes, the causation of it all, that in a way we were left with this impossible task, which seemed terribly, impractical, to sort of right all of those wrongs so that we could, literally stop this Dust Bowl effect, which she argues is still ongoing, that, we're still stripping the soil, depleting it, creating potential dust bowls and stuff. And of course, in a sort of philosophic sense, she's probably right, that all those things contributed and led up to this. Even if we could somehow miraculously make that all right, though, we wouldn't be in the same place as we were before. I remember us discussing that reality, right? And so that, I think, contributed to the sort of empty feeling we had at the end of that book. I don't know if Spencer, did you have impressions on it?
Yeah, I agree with you insofar as, I think the most charitable read is that she at least points out that, given our settler colonial history, it's not enough to think we can have moderate reforms or that we can have a green capitalism. We need something much more radical and racially just, and that allows us to come to terms with our history. And I don't even disagree with that in the abstract necessarily, but then this is to your point. What do we do with that? We live in a country where Sanders couldn't get the nomination, so we're not even going to get green capitalism. It seems to me.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that sort of internal colonization, I think, is the powerful aspect of really reading that very opening sort of segment of that book, of really understanding the way that each generation of people on a land have a very distinct capacity to either elevate that land or to radically change that land into something that is totally unrecognizable. I mean, right now, we could point to a modern issue right now. The Great Salt Lake is about a third of the size it was in 1980. Yet the population in the area continues to rise. There are 3 rivers that feed it, but those rivers also feed all the water needs for the Wasatch Front there in Salt Lake. So what do? Do you divert more water from the rivers into commercial cisterns to provide water for people? Do you fill it back into the Great Salt Lake that's full of heavy minerals from years worth of industrial diggings and industrial sort of waste and pollution? Keep that stuff buried? There's a lot of problems. There's no easy solution to how do you deal with the issue of wherever you go, people need water, and how do you responsibly use that so to make sure that resource is still there for people who come after you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reminds me of the Ogallala aquifer issue right here in Kansas. Similar in a way, we've been depleting it for a long time without really giving it a whole lot of thought. And then now we've been through several years we've been in a technical drought for a while, and up until this spring, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And it's getting to critical levels. People may not even be able to live out there pretty soon, let alone farm. California is experiencing similar things. I mean, in your experience, like as a historian, have people been like this in the past, or is this really kind of something that is mainly a characteristic of capitalism?
I mean, realistically, this is something that that I would argue has come along with capitalism and has only been intensified through industrialization. I mean, many communities that we speak of and know about in California are artificially created. In the late 19th century, huge pipelines moved water from the mountains into create cities like LA, San Bernardino, these lower Californian cities that otherwise would have been a desert. And those were intentionally built like such to bring in populations. I mean, it was almost like you had commercial developers who were coming in and building whole cities and pumping in water the whole time. And a lot of that knowledge was taken from that sort of experiment in Southern California, moved to places like South Africa and Australia, specifically with the purpose of trying to replicate this sort of process. But what they found when they did these sort of things is that societies are different. Just because you take a technology from one place and plop it down somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean that new society is going to take to it in the same way. Societies artificially accept or reject technologies that either meet their needs or don't meet their needs for whatever reason. But when this water movement technology was taken to Australia to try and populate the interior of Australia, it met with abysmal failure. People didn't want to live out there on the periphery of the world. And when it moved to South Africa, the hope was that it would bring sort of democratic society with it. And arguably that was not the function of bringing water to areas, trying to lessen the stress on society by making more resources available. Didn't have the same effect, didn't increase the freedom or the sovereignty of the individuals living there. In fact, it tightened the noose on many of those people. So
sounds like many arguments are made for implementing ideas that are good for a few or are thought up by a few, and then the justifications start? Am I?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, even when Europeans first showed up on the North American continent, on the eastern coast, water rights moved as riparian rights, right? As water sort of flowed through, you just used whatever you needed. But that wasn't true with the Southwest, particularly where the Spanish had sort of come into Central America and up into the North American plain. There were actually like laws, and people had jobs that were all tied to control of this water. How you moved water, who was responsible for controlling the canals, and it ensured fairness by ensuring that everybody got a little bit of what was there. And these sort of laws clashed very, very, very strenuously, sort of at the end of the American Civil War era, as Americans really started to sort of colonize the American Southwest, moving Latin American populations, Asian American populations out, and bringing more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant personages to these areas really changed the way that those laws were functioning. And it moved more towards that riparian ideal that basically said, I'll use the water as it comes through my area, and then whatever leaves, whatever I want to dump in it, it's gone. That's it's my rights to this water, which increasingly made water a harder and harder thing to come by. Again, so the wealthier you were, the more land you could purchase, or choice land you could purchase, the more control you would have over your fellows, giving you that market advantage. Again, there's no really other way to put that.
And how conscious do you think this was as these laws evolved and as like waves of immigration displaced other people?
It was very, very intentional. It was coming through with this ideal, these hardcore laws. That there were water laws that were written initially in the state of Colorado, what would become the state of Colorado, that sort of codified this Spanish common law of control of water, that were looked at initially, say in New Mexico and Arizona, as potential models to build off of. But as more white Anglo-Saxons came into the area, those ideas were dropped, as seen as inferior to their own ideals of how laws should be written, how industrial rights work, the rights of capitalist improvements to the land, shall we say, be those mining, be those what have you. So a lot of things were terraformed specifically because there were individuals that had money and desire to change the landscape in whatever way they wanted. And they bought up tremendous plots of land that were sort of individual works to create massive conglomerated mining consortiums or other industrial sort of outputs. But that's a lot of what this is a lot of it is intentionally, we're not wanting to interfere with the rights of businesses to move forward, or at the expense of individual peoples.
So what, could we do a thought experiment for a second and like imagine an alternate dimension where like Latin common law had won out? How do you imagine Colorado would look today?
Well, I would guarantee that many places that are dependent upon the Colorado River for their water supply, places like Los Angeles and Phoenix, Las Vegas, all dependent upon the Colorado River for their water. Those sort of places wouldn't exist. You would have controls along the way to ensure that each of those intentional built communities along the way were getting a share of water that was fair. So when you look at places that are built in an unsustainable environment, there's natural reasons why people aren't populating those. And when you dump in huge amounts of people onto those population centers, there's no resources there. So whatever resources are there, you have to move from somewhere else. But if we're doing the thought experiment of what would have happened if Spanish law would have taken place, there would have been individuals responsible at each of these shutter points along these gullies, moving this water along, that would have controlled and ensured that the water is moving, that everybody is getting an equal share, and that sort of discussion is ongoing as to what is going on with the water this season or this month. How much can we release from dams? How much can we gain from aquifers to responsibly use this sort of process? So in a lot of ways, they almost had very early versions of, say, something like water boards, municipal water boards. But these sort of laws would have ensured that, we probably wouldn't have these tremendous wildfires that you see strushing out across the American West like we have the last few years, because those resources would have been intentionally maintained in a very American style ideal of that sort of very early conservationism, not as it's been known today, but in this idea that you need to maintain stands of woodland and water and other resources, almost like strategic resources.
I was just going to back up for a second while Spencer's obviously cooking up something in his head to like further deploy here in a thought experiment. But like, could you explain for our listeners his reference to Latin common law a little bit more, and how it is that we know that what you are saying about how water would be regulated actually, that?
Yeah, so no worries about that. So when the Spanish initially landed, we're going all the way back to the 15th century here. When the Spanish showed up in the New World, they started creating laws, and these laws were codified. They were written down, but these sort of laws carried through cultural changes, even as nations were built, sort of European-styled nations were built in the Americas. They were all sort of built in Central and South America. A lot of the Caribbean were sort of built off this idea of what Spanish common law was. And so after the Mexican-American War in 1848, Mexico gave up a tremendous amount of land that ended up being the American Southwest. People living in those areas had lived under this Spanish common law. In fact, the treaties that were made between the United States and Mexico when this land was given over was that those rights would be maintained and preserved. So they're actually written down in the treaties exactly what these sort of rights were to entail. And then it took those states, New Mexico and Arizona, the longest to become member nations. It wasn't until right before World War I that those two would enter the nation as actual states. They remained just sort of the territories from 1848 till about 1912, 1914. So even at that point, it kind of gives you some indication about the way that sort of interior colonialization was working. You had to make sure that the population centers there were sort of transferred from what they were under Spanish common law into what we would call English common law. And that those institutions, those systems, the populations were quote unquote Americanized. They were part and parcel of what the rest of the nation was, so much as a nation can be homogenous.
And so imagine it had stayed that way. We would have a much more moderate use of our water instead of this like waspy program where like it's my water, my choice. I get to use as much of it as I can, and people downriver can enjoy whatever comes through. Like, just to play devil's advocate, like, are there ways in which this alternate dimension where like Anglo-Saxon norms weren't established and we didn't have maximum industrialization and resource consumption, would there be any cons that you can think of?
So one of the issues that I know has come up time and time again, there's still actually some areas in New Mexico that carry on this tradition, and this idea of having a sort of an overall individual who's responsible. Everybody pays this individual, every landowner pays this individual to ensure that essentially that they have access to water. And a lot of it is pretty interesting. But I think we absolutely could go into a very different mode in this other universe here, of seeing that individual becoming more corruptified, more about capitalist endeavors than others. It's always the idea, right? Who watches the watch? Who polices the police? Who guards the guards? All these sort of ideas of what happens when one individual or one group has power and authority over another. How do you maintain that balance, that sense of fairness and equality? And that is a very real question.
Yeah, I would expect, especially if we're not talking about the alternate universe, but ours, for those places that still try to do this, they're operating in a context that makes it almost overwhelmingly tempting to use that power and knowledge of the natural resource to gain some sort of advantage.
Yes, without a doubt.
And I would assume part of the rhetoric to justify this like changing over into Anglo-Saxon norms was that it was like decentralizing and democratizing the commons, or was
yes.
it?
Yeah, that was the idea, right? Is that we're spreading democracy, proper democracy to these people, and we're doing it and ensuring a way that it spreads in an acceptable manner, right? It's not just out there to flow on its own and become something different. If it's going to become part of the United States, we want to make sure that it is part of the United States that we want it to be part of. So there were a lot of individuals who were responsible specifically for setting in these institutions and carrying forward with laws that were essentially, cut, copy, paste from somewhere else in order to ensure that these sort of townships and communities that were built followed in line with this very sort of set ideal.
When these changes happen, and these institutions are corrupted or they're rejected in favor of the quote democratizing process, and we all know that we get a lot of rhetoric about how this is going to be better for everybody and a rising tide lifts all boats and it'll be, we'll all be able to handle this and gain an advantage from it. But then that doesn't happen for a lot of people, and the environment gets used up and creating these metabolic rifts that Hanshu was talking about last time. I guess my question is, does anybody believe that who's in other words, is in your opinion, in American rhetoric, when people have made these kind of liberal justifications for deregulating, basically, is kind of what we're talking about, to use different language. Are those felt and actually like sincere on average, or are they mere rhetoric designed to, I guess, fool people into handing over their collective control of these goods?
I would argue that you could argue either side of that. There have been cases where regulation has been equally as corrupting as deregulation has been, and the Dust Bowl is honestly a great example of that. You've probably heard of the Homestead Act that moved settlers from the eastern seaboard into the American interior. Well, after the American West was sort of settled, right? The idea is that the rain follows the plow, right? This was the sales quote, is that wherever you go, rain's going to follow it, because we start working in the land that releases moisture into the air. It creates this idea. Okay. And the United States government decided that we need to expand this Homestead Act. There's still a lot of corners of the American West that aren't settled. And we're specifically talking about these areas: Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, these sort of areas, right? And so instead of just getting 160 acres, as was promised in the Homestead Act of 1862, by 1904, if you were moving into Nebraska, say, you could get 640 acres. Other places in this area, you could get 320 acres. That's huge amounts of land. And you start looking at it we broaden that spectrum out. around this same time, you start talking about World War I starting up. You have the Russian Revolution starting up. You have a lot of people wanting to leave Europe and come to the United States. And you have a lot of people who are leaving sort of settled society in the American South and wanting to push into the interior to sort of escape Jim Crow laws or these institutions that maintain poverty of all segments of society. The problem is when these people are coming in, generally speaking, they're not classically trained as farmers. Many of these people may be trained as sharecroppers, but they're looking to turn the very most out of the land that they can get in that season. And then, sort of this short time idea, which this land from about this area of the United States, and here when we're talking again that sort of panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, into Nebraska, New Mexico, Colorado, that sort of area here, it was unusually wet at the very end of the 19th century. So for about 30 years there, it was unusually wet. It was, absolutely. However, when you continue to move people into these areas that were never sustaining this sort of life, and you moving cattle, you start causing a lot of erosion. And one of the ideas that came up during the dry 30s from the American government was to start buying cattle, forcibly buying cattle from ranchers in this area. And the idea was that we would take that excess food, if the cows were healthy, tin it and give it to the poor. The same with food. We take this excess food stuff and we'd sell it to the poor. But the problem is that these areas were so devastated. Whatever you're raising is probably not going to be very quality to begin with. Mm-hmm. It even moved so much it got into extending that into cotton rights and other sort of cash crops that really had nothing to do with anything, that weren't in fact about saving water or about soil retention. They turned into these programs of forcible selling of products to the government in order to sort of secure these sort of things. But these are all processes that went through that allowed for this land, whatever land we're talking about here, to become friable, to become overgrazed, to become the problem that it was. And this is ultimately what is responsible, was this just idea of we can essentially terraform our land. We just put people there, modern technology, modern solutions, modern all these things. It made a lot of problems that were tried to deal with in the 30s. The Department of the Interior started doing things like creating topsoil preservation programs and educational outreach programs for these agricultural crops. But a lot of these people who had initially moved out to the American West here during this time were moving out there because there were huge amounts of governmental contracts to buy food specifically for the First World War. And at the end of the war, the contracts just got cut. People were left with huge expanses of land, no way to pay for it. They'd taken out huge amounts of loans, again, to buy equipment, to buy seed, to buy everything. And it was kind of okay if you were a farm owner, but imagine being a farm worker during this time. There were no subsidies for these people who were living in these areas. It was for the owner of the farm that you may potentially get subsidies. So it took a long while before some of those acts sort of changed around, like through the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that really came through and started saying, hey, we can pay, you're allowed to use some of this money that we're giving you to maintain your farm or to buy these goods from you, to support some of your farm workers. We're trying to rebuild equity in some of these small towns. But imagine in maybe 15 or 20 years worth of no support, most of these communities were pretty devastated ever before an environmental crisis ever showed up. People just didn't have the money to continue to operate these huge expanses of farms. And then we get to the capitalist farms again. You get the corporate farms that come in and buy up a lot of these at either they've been foreclosed, or the land's just too much for one person to handle without enough help. And to get out from that, a lot of farmers sold. pennies on the dollar, these lands, and were gobbled up in massive corporate farming expeditions. And a lot of those still continue to get government subsidies for long periods of time.
And so on an adjacent topic,
Mhm.
could you explain real quick to the listeners why in a country where farmers are dominated by capitalist imperatives, why they can't just practice like good ecologically sound agriculture? Why, if in fact you agree, it's not just their bad morality.
No,
that creates
yeah,
problems.
I don't think it is their bad morality in any way, shape, or form. I think there's a lot of issues. For a long time, things like farmers co-ops were not even legal entities, right? Farmers couldn't even band together to help one another out, act as a middleman for negotiating for, say, transportation railroad contracts to transport their goods from point of production to point of sale, right? And it took a long time before these sort of things even started appearing. But just because a new institution or a new idea like a farmers co-op pops up doesn't mean that everybody automatically buys in, right? People are coming around. There was a lot of movements like the Granger movement in the end of the 19th century. There was a lot of farmers sort of unionizing, and a lot of these were around these societies that were sort of built initially as trying to help educate one another, trying to bring up the level of education. I feel probably Spencer and Laurie both are far, far superior to I when talking about what it takes to actually plant something in the ground and make it produce something edible, right? I'm a hunter of the grocery store, whereas the two of you are very much producers in your own rights. But these sort of mechanisms often touted either the buying of corporate seeds. This education mechanism often touted either buying of corporate seeds, expanding your lot through, say, the purchase of a tractor or a combine or whatever piece of equipment is. But they all came with a supposed shortcut for you to get up on the system. And it became a system very much where you can't sustain yourself over a long duration of time and keep up with corporate farmers as an individual small farmer, keeping up with corporate farms and making sure that whatever you're raising this year is even going to be worth anything once you bring it to market. Is going to be a challenge, right? And so a lot of it pays to, okay, you give over to the system. You start buying corporatized seed instead of using your own seed that season to season to season, right? You start buying these sort of things because this seed is now protected against weeds or is better against dry
Diseases.
Seasons or whatever. Yeah, whatever it is. But these sort of technologies come in. I mean. Now, I know it's crazy as you think about it. From your smartphone, many farmers can look at exactly how moist every part of their field is. They're flying drones over it. They have automated watering systems and measurement systems. They know exactly what kind of nutrients are in their fields. This is not low tech sort of stuff. This is not, yeoman farmer of the Jeffersonian era. This is very much a money centric enterprise. So just because it's about food or any other type of horticulture or animal raising, right? Doesn't mean it's not about money ultimately. And we're seeing a lot of that. But one of the issues is it's easy to turn that stuff on, right? It's easy to sort of incrementally add technologies or add these sort of things to the system. It's very hard to turn that stuff off. Once people have gone over to this sort of thing, it becomes very, very hard to try and revert in any way, shape, or form to what they were doing. And I think that's just the crux of this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, and for me, one of the most, like, on the positive side of things, what was most interesting to me about this book is she chronicles how, like, the conventional narrative I got growing up in Western Kansas about the Dust Bowl is, well, the farmers, they tilled too much, so the soil was exposed. There weren't plants anchoring the soil, and then here comes the dryness and the winds, and it all blows away. but there's this idea that like, well, we didn't know that was going to happen. And what she documents is that like, oh no, like American soil scientists for
Yeah.
decades were like, we shouldn't be spreading west with this kind of agriculture. It's even crazier than doing it on the east, in the east. And then she goes to, not only did elites in America know that this was going to happen, but go to, off the top of my head, I think in South Africa and Australia, this was discussed as well. The same issues, which is our modern industrialized farming practices degrade soil health.
Yep.
And also she documents how not only were soil scientists saying this, but various like progressive reformer elites were like, well, we should do something about it. And maybe we'll do some government stuff, but mostly these farmers should stop being moral reprobates and start farming responsibly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Spencer. And I know in the book she talked about how long it takes to create soil, like through the natural process to really do this.
Mm-hmm.
Very quickly, these farmers moved through a tremendous amount of that earth using what would be sort of common practices. It's not like they were just out there being reprobates or miscreants. They were doing what they knew to do. The problem is here, as you said, and so very clearly, that people did know. Many people did know. The scientific data was there. In many ways, it became an issue, much like waving a flag that reads "Save the whales." It's almost too big for any one individual to see how their contribution can change this situation. And so it sort of gets pushed off onto, well, governments or world leaders or whatever it may be need to take on this challenge and do something with it. Well, oftentimes they're people who have a lot on their plate, and this is a hard problem. This is a sticky situation that is going to take generations to solve or to deal with. And quite often that stuff gets pushed to the back burner merely because it's too hard.
Yeah, it's too hard. And because also in a lot of cases, the political leaders are partly, if not a lot, beholden to the very, economic forces that have kind of instigated the process to begin with. I mean, this is an example of what Spencer and Jacob talked about last time with abstract domination, isn't it? Like, because basically you're saying, it's misplaced to sort of morally castigate individual farmers for making decisions that aren't responsible for the soil, because there's a whole lot of economic and political forces that have sort of boxed them in and led them on to doing what they're doing. And those things would have to be fixed. And then the question is, how can they be fixed? And basically, I know you're right. Like that, the wicked problems are the ones that people just punt and put off and keep putting off and keep putting off. And that's quite regardless of whether they're Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals.
Yeah. But pure and simple, a situation like this, the soil issue, if we were just to look at this, would probably take 5 to 6 generations worth of concerted effort and in a very, very focused trajectory to affect change. And quite honestly, that's not going to get you reelected, right? That's not what politicians want to get into. That's not going to wrap up within their timeline to be able to take credit for any of that.
How much of any of this could be fixed in your view by stepping back from globalization, at least when it comes to trade in foodstuffs?
Well, I think we're seeing right now, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine took something like 30% of the wheat market off the global scale, right? That affects the entirety of the globe. The Ukraine, the bloodlands that exist there, that have existed there for centuries. It is the breadbasket of Europe. So when something like this happens, it affects all communities. So the theory, and it may be a utopian ideal, right, to revert to this sort of localized, very communal sort of activity, right? Does that mean I can't have guacamole for the Super Bowl? Yeah, it sure does. But you know what? Do I really need guacamole? I don't. I don't. In
No.
fact, the whole idea here, though, is I think.
Do we need a Super Bowl? I would ask, but anyway.
Yeah, well, so there's that too, Spencer. But I think what we're seeing here is, in a lot of ways, is you're asking for people to make a tremendous reversal in behaviors. It's going to take something of massive impact to change the way that they view on these things. Something far more than a war in the Ukraine, or something far more than rust or blight of wheat or something like that, right? It's going to take something of real magnitude to catch people's attentions. We got lucky. We being the Americans of this era got lucky in that eventually we were able to sort of put a lid on the desertification of this area. But you look around the world, and there are other sites. The RLC in Russia is another great example. A community that was once very rich in fishing. Now you can just see it's nothing but thousands of square miles of rotting fishing boats in the middle of a desert, all to divert water to make a hydroelectric dam that, but once you remove these sort of things, putting them back in place is going to be very, very hard. Southeast Asia has a number of these similar issues going on. The Mekong Delta, a number of the rivers that feed Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, originate in China and are being dammed by the Chinese for hydroelectric dams, but that affects millions of people downstream. So at what point do we say that the Chinese have a right or don't have a right to do something within their national borders? And because it affects someone downstream, whose problem is that? And where do we draw the lines on equity? And I just don't know. Even if you just revert entirely to localities, right, that argument falls apart right there.
Right. And if you go the other direction to international government, there's no guarantee there. There's absolutely no guarantee that an international government would do the right thing. Mm-hmm. So there is no easy solution. I don't know, Spencer, would you agree with that or not? I think you agree with that probably, but do you put a lot of stock in international organization?
Not with our current batch of demented gerontocrats. No.
Yeah. And I would say not for our future demented gerontocrats too.
Sure.
Because they just replace each other as time goes by. Yeah.
So then what, because we need to wrap it up for the moment. Given your historical acumen and perhaps bringing in your experience in the military, how do you look out at the current state of affairs and Holleman's projected dust bowlification of the world as climate change worsens? What do you see?
I mean, I absolutely see that, and unless major changes are made in all of our actions, and it does take a collective response. This desertification is going to happen on a much broader scale in many more communities, and making it that much harder to sustain life on this planet. I know that the idea of the Green Revolution, right, was to be able to plant more food to save more people. We put more people on the planet, which is, admittedly a good thing. Saving people from dying, I think, is a good thing. However, at what cost is really the question mark here, and who gets to decide whether it's acceptable to lose people and to lose land in other territories that people are actively going on. So I think we're almost beyond the point of being able to bring this back. It doesn't mean we can't mitigate the circumstances moving forward, but we got to change a lot and fast in order for anything to really be. So much like Holleman, I'm going to leave you with this big, hey, I don't have a plan. I don't have a course of action. I don't have anything good other than.
How are you feeling about Kanye in 2024?
I feel he's got a real solid, strong approach, especially in certain red states. I think he's got it.
Maybe we can turn to him for this help and guidance we need.
Yeah. Spencer, are you still running as his Secretary of State?
I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I don't think I'm going to make the cut.
I don't think so either. Well, I know we do need to wrap it up for this time, but like I was wondering, I think I'm speaking for both of us, if you would like to come back for a part 2. Because,
Sure.
I mean, this conversation has kind of led to like, at least in my mind, I think the need for some futuring, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep, for that, because I think there's nobody like a historian that can, like, based on knowledge of the past, project into the future, right? Like, you all do that better than anybody.
I'd love to come back. Yes.
All right. I'm taking that to the bank. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Thank you both.